Hello there! In this tutorial, we'll focus on requirements collecting techniques. A project's success is largely impacted by how well all stakeholders are aligned with gathering the right, complete set of requirements. Most of us have seen the situation where halfway through a project, the team becomes disoriented in attempting to accommodate scope creep, or worse yet, trying to implement a feature service that wasn't exactly vetted well during the planning phase of a project. And of course, there's the situation where implied requirements somehow sneak in. You've probably seen something like this, where someone in a product ownership role basically assumes that the team knew that, by the way, this particular feature needed to run 50% faster or something like that. This is commonly known as gold plating. It's never a good thing to take place on a project that's schedule bound. Bye-bye there. Okay, according to Barry Boehm, that's B-O-E-H-M, in his article Quantitative Evaluation of Software Quality some 25 years ago, found that correcting a requirement after a product was put into a user's hands costs as much as up to 68 times the cost. But what the original effort would have been down here. But by the time it gets in the customer's hands and the requirements weren't right, it can cost you. What is the definition of a requirement? There's three I'd like to present. The IEEE definition magically shows up. It's amazing how fast this hand can actually write all that stuff up. A requirement is a condition or capability needed by a user to solve a problem or achieve an objective. According to the PMBOK guide, wow, what is that? Let's try that again. Okay, better. According to the PMBOK guide, a requirement is defined as the project and product features and functions needed to fulfill stakeholders' needs and expectations. Pretty wordy. I guess that makes sense. The one that I like is my own definition. A requirement is a feature definition that satisfies a customer need. Pretty Jethro simple, I would say, wouldn't you? So let's talk about the characteristics of a requirement. According to Al Davis, the author of Software Requirements, Objects, Functions, and States, who is a wild, intelligent, and nutty author and college computer science professor in the mountains of Colorado that I've known from the past, he's come up with a checklist that, in my opinion, really puts a requirement through the acid test. And these are the characteristics. It needs to be complete. So it needs to be thorough. It needs to be correct. It needs to be feasible. In other words, realistic to produce. Of course, if it isn't, that's a problem. Then you're defining something that really can't be accomplished. It needs to be necessary. Needs to be prioritized. So it must be something that someone really, really wants to use. Those are the most important ones to focus on. You know that because of Agile. Needs to be traceable. Consider numbering each one to make sure it gets referenced and validated. A simple way to make sure that the feature works is to have some sort of numbering scheme that clearly identifies it. Ambiguous. So stakeholders should walk away with exactly the same understanding that the team does. And last but not least, needs to be verifiable. Makes sense that you need to be able to test it. So those are the characteristics. What about the knowledge areas that we've talked about before with PMI teachings? Used and defined in the PMBOK guide. Knowledge areas. We tend to call those KAs. The project scope management knowledge area, one of the first planning processes is collect requirements. You do that before you define the scope, and then ultimately you're going to create your work breakdown structure. So you can see here that this is the process that we are talking about. With each of these processes, there's of course inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. So let's talk about the inputs. There's two fundamental ones. There's the project charter, and then there's the stakeholder register. Those go into the collect requirements process. So what is actually produced? Well, glad you asked. It's a requirement document itself. The document can be a document, like a Word document, a movie, PowerPoint, spreadsheet. It really doesn't matter, as long as the team agrees to the output. You can make it detailed or superficial. The true rule of thumb is to create something with the right level of information that the team can use to successfully implement. There's a couple of other ones that are showed in dotted lines that are, I believe, somewhat optional, and a lot depends on the sophistication of the project and the complexity of the project. Generally, I would recommend not using them, but I did want to cover them really quick. The first is a requirements management plan. This describes how requirements will be analyzed, documented, and managed. And finally, the requirements traceability matrix is a mapping to the business and project objectives you stated earlier in your project charter. This is where the fun part begins. So let's get rid of those guys. There are several requirements gathering techniques we're going to discuss. The first one is the interviews. And this is often in a one-on-one setting, and you have basically a stakeholder or subject matter expert, someone representing the team. Stakeholders are often asked questions to identify requirements. You're asking questions of a team member, and then they respond back, and you jot them down. This works well with introverts, which is unfortunately pretty much what we're used to in software IT business. What doesn't work well is it can take a long time to get meaningful feedback. And what you may want to do through the interview process is actually invite others. And that may work too, where you're interviewing several people, but you could see this fellow right here. There's a problem. If one person takes over and likes to hear him or herself talk, it can be a problem for the rest of the team that ends up shutting down. That's the interview process. Next one's brainstorming. This is a fast-paced technique where ideas are encouraged in a rapid-fire group setting. No idea is a bad idea. It's kind of in an ad hoc way of operating. You bring out a statement or a question regarding a requirement. Someone responds. It's noted in real time. It's usually very clock-driven, very fast. It's a kind of a free-for-all. It can be a very effective way of bringing in combined team experiences. On the negative side, if not run properly, can result in just a bunch of ideas, and once again, some people may hog the podium. This is also a great technique in identifying risks. Third way is a facilitated workshop, and this is where you gather requirements with a professionally run workshop, and this can be pretty incredible. You have a facilitator, usually someone that's highly organized and does this as a consulting relationship. It's commonly known as a JAD, J-A-D. This is where you have a joint application design effort. This approach has specific roles, and you probably participated in one of these, but you just didn't know it. So in this case, we have the facilitator over there with a whiteboard or whatever their technique is to get the information, and you have an executive sponsor. You have the team, which is the subject matter experts. You also have a scribe that takes notes and keeps track of everything. And then you have silent observers, and these folks are basically making sure throughout the entire process that there's enough of the right interaction taking place. You can have high degree of success. It can be relatively fast, and you do develop project ownership. You can get more feedback than other techniques as long as it's properly facilitated. The con could be extremely costly. But if the idea is to get the requirements done right, and you have the budget, and you know of an expert facilitator, this may be the way to go. Another technique, we're almost done, is the questionnaire. And the questionnaire is where you have a facilitator, and you have subject matter experts, and you have questionnaires. This is an age-old technique of getting feedback. And what you do is you basically have your predefined questionnaires in order to get the requirements, and you're handing them out to individuals separately, and they're filling it out separately. This may be a really great technique. The pro is you can have some fixed standard set of questions. The con is it doesn't lend itself to group interaction where you can get an incredible benefit from the feedback of folks feeding on each other's knowledge. And sometimes other ideas and concepts bring up more innovative ways to define the requirements. The last technique that we're going to discuss is a group decision technique. In the group decision technique, you're leading the requirements collecting process, and you've got your subject matter experts, in other words, the team. This method encourages group consensus or voting techniques as well as collect, identify, and categorize requirements. There are 4 group decision techniques we're going to briefly discuss. One is unanimous, unanimity. And this is where all the subject matter experts agree. And they agree to the requirement, and if they don't, you don't have a requirement. So that's one technique. Sorry, I misspelled that, but I just can't help it. Another is majority rules. And this is where you have this person agrees to the requirement, this person agrees to the requirement, and this one doesn't. But it doesn't matter. 2 of the 3 did agree, and so that requirement is used in the project. The third is consensus. This is always fun. This person agrees, this person agrees, this one really doesn't or isn't sure. They basically decide, okay, I'll agree with you guys. Then you have the other technique, which is dictatorship. And this is where you as the project manager or the scrum master say, this is the requirement, this is what it ought to be, and regardless whether individuals on the team agree or not, that requirement carries. That's probably one of the least popular techniques. So now you know.
Oh!